Welcome to the presentation Through Paul's Eyes, Strategies of Financial Support for Mission and Ministry. I'm Kris Bentley, and I work at Lexington Theological Seminary directing the Bi-vocational Ministry Research Project at LTS, which is supported through grants from the Lilly Endowment. Often when the topic turns to bivocational ministry, the Apostle Paul is cited as evidence of it as a biblical model present in the earliest times of the church. Paul's centrality is reflected in the use of the term tent making for certain styles of bivocational ministry. According to Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 3, Paul supported himself as a tent maker or leather worker while he ministered in Corinth. Later in Acts 20:35, Paul is quoted as stating he worked with his own hands to support himself and his companions. Paul confirmed this practice himself when he wrote to the church in Corinth, and he referred again to a practice of supporting himself and others when ministering at Thessalonica and at Ephesus. Paul's letters provide information about his own practice of supporting himself, as well as other ways that teachers, preachers, and missionaries were supported in the earliest times of the church. 4 patterns of support emerged at that time, sometimes used in combination. Payment from the church to those who preached and taught there, gifts given by the church to those working in the broader mission, lodging and meals provided by church members, and the voluntary labor of some evangelists to support themselves. In working to support himself while teaching and preaching, Paul showed his preference for one strategy, while other teachers, preachers, and missionaries in the church adopted other strategies. These strategies also reflected those widely debated by Hellenistic philosophers and teachers at that time, such as charging fees, entering the household of a wealthy patron, begging, and working. One of the reasons given by philosophers who favored working to support themselves was the way it empowered their independence to speak and think freely. The vigorous patronage system present at that time was understood to undermine the freedom of thought and speech for these philosophers. Paul gave several reasons he and other companions supported themselves through their labor. The reasons included 1, not being a burden to those to whom they preached; 2, the furthering of the gospel of Christ; 3, his own right to relinquish privilege; 4, avoiding indebtedness to the church; and 5, serving as an example to the church. Paul's work also provided opportunities to further his evangelistic mission. Although he did not describe it explicitly in Scripture, as a tradesperson, Paul would have encountered a variety of people on a regular basis. In Corinth, for example, work such as Paul's took place in shops near the Agora, where people of various walks of life gathered and shopped. Archaeological work has revealed that during the time Paul was in Corinth, a series of small shops were located around a central square. Working in one of those shops with proximity to the Agora, ample workspaces, as well as numerous windows and doorways, Paul had access and opportunity to interact with co-workers, clients, and municipal officials, as well as with the crowds of people passing by in the street. It is likely Paul followed well-established patterns of Hellenistic philosophers, such as Stoics and Cynics, by using public buildings and workshops of the marketplace for teaching. Paul certainly would have used his workplace as a setting for teaching and preaching to further the gospel, just as he did in local synagogues and in houses throughout his missionary journeys. While people in the present time look back on Paul's practice with general approval, His practice at the time was controversial, at least in Corinth. His vigorous arguments in 1 Corinthians 9, 1 through 18, and 2 Corinthians 11, 5 through 15, reveal that working to support himself instead of accepting economic support from the church in Corinth was opposed by some in the church. Opponents impugned Paul's apostolic authority because he did not accept their support, as others had. They implied that Paul's ministry was less than those who accepted pay. However, Paul claimed his work as validation of his apostleship. In response to opponents, he put forth his willingness to lower his social status through manual labor for their benefit as an example of the way God works through weakness. Paul reinterpreted the perception that was present in the surrounding Hellenistic culture that by working with his hands, Paul lowered his social status and perhaps that of the church in Corinth in some inappropriate way. While Paul continued a strong defense of his practice as furthering the gospel in Corinth, he also asserted the right of ministers to be paid for their work. You can see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 3 through 18. Paul was aware his model of self-support through labor was one of many models of economic support necessary in the gospel work in diverse contexts. His own practice was not identical in every context either. While refusing financial support from the church in Corinth, he accepted it from the Philippians. It is not surprising that in connection with financial support for ministry, Paul found that what seemed appropriate to the gospel in one setting was not acceptable in another. His acceptance of support from the Philippians and refusal from the Corinthians reveals the complexity of economic relationships then and now. Much has changed since Paul's time and place, when various models for financial support for those teaching and preaching in the church were still emerging. In the present time, churches have primarily adopted the strategy of paying ministers who teach, preach, and serve. The model of bivocational ministry is re-emerging as a significant part of the larger conversation about strategies for financial support of ministers who are working in the church or as missionaries. Clearly, in our contemporary context, bivocational ministry is interpreted in various ways. Thank you for viewing this presentation. As you think about what has been shared in this video, what similarities and differences do you notice in connection with strategies for financial support found in Paul's letters in the New Testament and contemporary bivocational ministry?